are you? Nice to see you.
Good. So welcome. We have
Thank you.
we have a really great large group here tonight. We're so excited and we're so happy that you're here joining us tonight. And a lot of them are in the Broadway world, but the good news is if you gave any of them bad reviews, we're on Zoom, so you're safe.
They can't hit me.
They
I have
can't
been hit
hit you.
before. Back in the days when you could go to places like Orso or Angus McIndoe or Bar Centrale, you could run into people you gave bad reviews to. And a few times, a few people have slugged me over the years. So
yes, we just had the Angus conversation with some people here who remembered that particular story.
Zoom has been very good for me. I'm totally safe in my apartment, barricaded in. No one can touch me.
Well, that's terrific. So we're so excited to be here tonight and celebrate your book, Singular Sensation. I'm holding it up here on my little screen.
Wait, I can get it too. Hold on.
Yeah. It's Singular Sensation, the Triumph of Broadway, and it's the follow-up to your best-selling first book, which was Razzle Dazzle, The Battle for Broadway. So we've been talking about you, but I want to give you a proper introduction, Michael. So many of you know Michael as a longtime theater columnist for the New York Post, and like everyone involved in Broadway, right now he's furloughed from that job too, but fortunately, you have another really terrific gig, and that's as the co-host of the Len Berman and Michael Riedel show, which is on 710 WOR, and it's weekdays from 6 to 10. My husband and I are huge fans of your show. We listen every morning, and I know a lot of other people here were saying that they listen to, and it's a fun, entertaining show, and we just love it. And Michael is fun. He's witty, and he's also irreverent, and he also has a great sense of humor, because in my original promotion for this event for Michael, I had said he was fun, witty, and irrelevant, and he actually mentioned that on the air one morning. Fortunately, he was laughing about it, and we did get a shout out for it, but he will never be irrelevant, that's for sure.
No, it was the best billing I've had in my life. Fun, witty, and irrelevant, and I had to say it was completely and utterly true. I have never been more irrelevant in my existence as I am right now.
Oh my gosh. I think we would disagree with you on that. But so before we talk about the book, though, it is happy hour. It's a happy hour book club event. And you were very kind enough and you recommended a wonderful Spa Valley Sauvignon Blanc, which I'm actually drinking.
Oh,
and
yes, I happen
really
to have
good.
the bottle.
Beautiful. Right, it's excellent. So I'm doing a little toast to you, Michael, because we want this book to be another bestseller, and I'm sure it will, because it is a fabulous book. And
well, let me tell you, Cheryl, how I discovered this Spa Valley Sauvignon Blanc. Very good Sauvignon Blanc, about $20 in your local wine store, if you can find it. Kind of hard to find, but years ago, I guess this would have been maybe in 2011, 2012. I went to Australia to do a story for the New York Post on, it was a travel piece about going to Australia. In fact, I was going to learn how to dive. I was learning how to dive in the Great Barrier Reef. That was kind of the gimmick of the story. So I flew to Sydney, checked into my hotel, and the marketing director for Qantas Airways wanted to meet me because they had, I'd flown on Qantas, and the publicity people, the marketing people wanted to meet me. So I met them for lunch at the terrific museum in Sydney. I've forgotten the name of it now, but it's basically the Metropolitan Museum of Sydney, Australia. We had a lovely lunch out on the patio, beautiful day. And they came around to take the order, and the Australian guy from Qantas and his assistant, they said, "Oh, we'll have some sparkling water, please. I'll have some sparkling water." And I said, "Well, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to have a glass of wine because I'm sort of on holiday here. So I'd like, it's a beautiful setting. And I think I'll have a Sauvignon Blanc." And the two Australian people with me said, "Oh, really?" Well, I said, "Well, why don't we get a bottle?" And they said, we're always wary about you Americans because you only drink sparkling water at lunch. So that's why we only ordered sparkling water. I said, "Well, not me. I'm happy to have a glass of white wine." And they said, well, let's have a bottle. And about 4 bottles later and a 4.5 hour lunch, I somehow managed to stumble back to my hotel room and completely collapsed, and woke up the next day and managed to go through a run in that beautiful area of city. If you've been there, the beautiful park there by the Opera House. But those Australians, once you give them an inch, if you say, I'll have a glass, they'll say, how about a bottle? And then the bottle. And the guy,
My kind of people.
the head of Qantas, he said, I love this wine, Spy Valley. It's a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and I've been drinking it ever since.
Well, it's great. And thank you for sharing that with us. And it's excellent, I have to say. So we actually hosted your a live event, a real live event for your first book, Razzle Dazzle, The Battle for Broadway. It was actually at the writing room, which was the old Elaine's. And sadly, the writing room is a victim of COVID right now. They just recently closed their doors, as so many of our restaurants are. But
are they gone for good?
Yeah, they said that's what their website said. They had a nice little note. Very sad.
Sorry.
But in your first book, you cover Broadway, the Broadway of the 70s and 80s, and the resurgence of Times Square. And in Singular Sensation, you cover the 90s on Broadway up through 9/11. So tell us why you chose this particular decade. And then we have to talk about the timing of your book too, which obviously you had no control over.
Right. Well, I mean, the first book, Razzle Dazzle, was really trying to show how important Broadway was to New York City at a time when New York was struggling, when it was going bankrupt, and Times Square was dangerous. And, the one thing that New York has that no other city in the world has, and that's Broadway. And the handful of people stuck by Broadway, the Schuberts, the Nederlanders, Joe Papp, the Public Theater, Michael Bennett, who did A Chorus Line and Dreamgirls. And then in the 80s, you get the Andrew Lloyd Webber and the Cameron McIntosh shows, Cats, Les Mis, Phantom, Miss Saigon. Those are big, big shows. And I ended the book when one of the main characters in the first book, Razzle Dazzle, Bernie Jacobs, who was running the Schubert organization with his partner, Jerry Schoenfeld, back then, when Bernie died. And I really didn't think I had another book in me, but I signed a contract with Simon & Schuster, and they said, well, you better find another book because you're under contract for another book. And I kind of kicked around some ideas. And then it had occurred to me that, the 90s, which I covered as a reporter for the Daily News and then for the New York Post, that was a big decade on Broadway. With Andrew's shows and Cameron's shows, they really did establish Broadway as a big business. But in the 1990s, when you had shows like Rent, Angels in America, Chicago, The Lion King, leading up to Mel Brooks as the producers, those shows were as well known, as famous as any movie or television show of the 1990s. And I realized that decade of the 90s was a time when Broadway went back to being part of the mainstream of American popular and entertainment culture. And I thought, that's a story that I can tell because I covered all those shows, and you just saw Broadway get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it also had occurred to me that sort of the ambassador for Broadway back then was Rosie O'Donnell. She had that enormously popular talk show seen by 8 million people every morning, and Rosie loved the theater. So she was to the theater in the 90s what Ed Sullivan was to Broadway in the 50s and the 60s. She put all the actors on her show. She had scenes from the musicals on her show. And if you cast your mind back, as far as my mind goes, there was a time where the only time you ever saw a scene from a Broadway show was on the Tony Awards. It was once a year. And here was Rosie O'Donnell every morning putting Broadway shows on her hugely popular talk show. And then I thought, all right, there's a lot of good tales to be told about the 90s on Broadway and how Broadway then became a very, very big business. And then I was thinking, how do I end this book? And I was, here in my apartment. I looked out my window one morning as I was kind of mapping out the book, and it occurred to me. I said, once upon a time, when I looked out my living room window here in the West Village, I had a straight shot to the World Trade Center. And, I woke up that morning, September 11th, and I saw this big black gash in the North Tower with smoke coming out. You couldn't quite understand what was going on. And I thought, like everybody, a small plane hit the World Trade Center. And then I was just kind of standing there, and all of a sudden the second tower exploded. And, I watched those buildings fall. I mean, I saw 3,000 people murdered that day. And that morning I called Jerry Schoenfeld, who was chairman of the board of the Schubert organization. And I said, Jerry, what's going on? And he said, Michael, I don't know what we can do. I mean, the mayor said that Times Square is another terrorist target. We're concerned that there are bombs in Times Square. They could go off. There are terrorists at any moment. We're closing this thing down. And then Rudy Giuliani, when he was sane,
Yes.
he and I put this in the book because I did interview him for the book. And I got to tell you, when I interviewed him for the book, he sounded completely coherent, completely coherent. He had gone home that night, that Tuesday, September 11th, to try to get, an hour's worth of sleep so he could battle the next day. He was reading a biography of Winston Churchill, and he picked up that book, which was on his night table, and he turned to the chapter during the Blitz, during the bombing of London, when the Nazis were bombing the hell out of London. And he read in that book that Churchill insisted that the theater, the ballet, the opera, the museums, everything be open, everything go on, so that you could say to the Germans, F you, you're not going to bring us to our knees. And that planted the seed in Rudy's mind that I've got to tell the world that New York has not been brought to its knees by terrorists, that we are still open for business. Come to New York, spend money, support us. And the best signal I can send to the world that New York is still open, that we're not going to be broken by terrorists, is to have the lights of Broadway lit. And within 2 days, all of the shows on Broadway, they went up on September 13th, on Thursday. And I went with Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft to the producers that night. The hottest show in the world then. But maybe there were 500 or 600 people at the St. James, a lot of empty seats because people were scared, but people came. And I remember Matthew Broderick and Nathan Lane leading those 500 people, and me and Mel and Ann in the back of the house singing God Bless America in tears at the end of the show. And it just occurred to me, that is the way to end a book. How Broadway and the city, just when you think, my God, it's bigger and better than ever, and then this awful event happens, and yet within 2 days, the lights of Broadway are up again. And within a year, as I detail in the book, the strategy of getting Broadway back, Broadway was doing record grosses again within a year of September 11th. And so that's why I subtitled the book, The Triumph of Broadway, because in the face of what we thought was the existential crisis then, Broadway persevered. Broadway, the show went on. Broadway survived. And I finished that last chapter in February of this year. And I thought, okay, well, turn in the manuscript. And I treated myself to a little ski vacation in Italy. And one day I was skiing in the slopes of northern Italy at the foot of the Matterhorn. And I stopped to have a lunch and a glass of white wine. And I took a picture of the glass of white wine with a Matterhorn in the background. And I texted it to my girlfriend. And she said, where are you? And I said, I'm skiing in Italy. And she said, do you have any idea what's going on? And the God's honest truth, I was paying more attention to the primary. Was it going to be Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden? Than I was to this thing called the coronavirus. And she said, this virus is spiking all over northern Italy. Get out of there. And 2 days later, the resort I was in, Cervinia, was shut down because they had the coronavirus there. I came back to New York, second week of March, and Broadway shut down. We all thought it would be closed 2 weeks, 4 weeks at the most. 4 weeks at the most. 8 months later, no end in sight, and I have no idea when Broadway can come back. So here we are.
Well, and here we are. And I know we want to talk about that a little bit at the end, because I know that, you have such great inside connections with Broadway, and we'd love to hear what people are thinking and what will change with it. But it's really such a wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it all. And actually it took me a while, because when the book arrived, my husband grabbed it first and he read it. So I had to wait. And then I've been speed reading it for this evening, but it is,
my feeling is always, I think it's a book that you should have 2 books in your household, one for you and one for your husband.
Yes. Yes.
Always buy the second book. It helps my retirement fund.
Exactly. I know how that goes. But it's so well written, Michael. And what I really like about it, because it's really almost an investigative reporter perspective, because you could see your reporter background, because obviously you kept asking questions and you kept digging beyond and really finding out what was going on. And you do cover all the big shows of that decade, which I had kind of forgotten about, and it brought all of them back. And I think I probably saw almost all of them, you know, Rent, Angels in America, The Producers. And you also talk about some of the big flops too. But you also talk about a lot of the dishy stuff. So I thought we'll start out with some of that. And the first show that you talk about in the book is Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard, and how he actually managed to totally incur the ire of three divas, actually four, I guess, if you count Barbara Walters. So can you share that story? Because I didn't know that story at all.
Well, you know, when the book begins, and I do begin with Sunset Boulevard, because, you know, back then Andrew was at the height of his power. I mean, everybody thought a show had to have big sets and special effects and had to have a big, lush Andrew Lloyd Webber score. And Sunset Boulevard was the most expensive show of all time back then, $14-15 million, I think it was. And it had the big mansion, Norma Desmond's mansion that flew. And I remember going to the opening on Broadway. I think it was at the Minskoff Theater, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember thinking, you know what? Because I love the movie Sunset Boulevard. And there was a little part of me, and I do admire Andrew's score, you know, As If We Never Said Goodbye and With One Look are wonderful
Right.
musical theater songs. And it's a compelling story. But I just remember watching it and thinking, you know, this is actually an intimate story. It's really only about three people. It's about Norma Desmond, Joe Gillis, and Max the butler. And yet all of these big pop opera stuff was put on it because everything had to be so big then. And it just felt heavy. The whole production felt heavy. And of course, it was in the news a lot, not because of the quality of the show, but because Andrew hired Patti LuPone to do it in London, and they had a falling out. And Frank Rich went to see the show for the New York Times in London and said Patti LuPone was miscast. And Andrew fired Patti, and she sued him, and he had to give her like $1.5 million, I think. Then he had Glenn Close in the Los Angeles premiere of Sunset Boulevard, and when Glenn left to go to New York, he hired Faye Dunaway, and then he fired Faye Dunaway, and she sued him. And I have a little scene in the book, and this was told to me by someone who was on the phone call. Faye Dunaway called Patti LuPone and said to Patti, "What do I do?" And Patti said, "Sue the motherfucker." Excuse my language, but that's what she said. So Andrew was battling these lawsuits back and forth. And then, of course, Glenn Close has a triumph in Sunset Boulevard on Broadway. She wins the Tony Award. She gets great reviews. She decides to take a 2-week vacation. Her understudy, the wonderful Karen Mason, goes on. And Andrew didn't do this, but his company did this. They did not want the show to appear that it was not a hit without Glenn Close in it. So they lied to Variety, and they pretended that the grosses for the understudy were as good as they were for when Glenn was in the show. And my friend Jeremy Gerard, who was at Variety then, he got, and I detailed this in the book, he got an anonymous fax back in the days of faxes, which had the real grosses of the show when Glenn was gone and Karen was in. And there was a discrepancy each week of about $250,000. And Jeremy wrote that piece. He said, you know, they're lying about the grosses. They're trying to pretend the show's a hit even without Glenn Close. And Andrew apologized. And Glenn, I interviewed Glenn. It's a long time ago now. So Glenn was, I think she was in Bermuda, the Bahamas somewhere. So it's not like, you know, we're on text messages, we find everything going on. Somebody faxed her the story in Variety. And Glenn wrote this letter, which I have, which I saved to this day, because I did get a copy back in the day. Glenn saying, "How dare you, Andrew Lloyd Webber? How dare you make this show seem like it is just as good without me? I've been carrying this show. I am the star of the show." I mean, it was one of the great diva letters of all time. I quote most of it in the book. And at that point, Andrew was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe what is happening to me. Patti killed me, Faye killed me, and now Glenn is killing me. These women are
the
out."
trifecta of the divas, right?
Of the divas going. And then the just to give you a little coda there with Barbara Walters, as you bring up. And this is, I swear to God, a true story. It's also in the book. When all of this stuff was behind Andrew, with Patti and Faye and Glenn, I was at the Attorney General's office here in New York, because you could go down to the office back in those days and get the offering papers for every Broadway show. And it told you how much the capitalization was, how much the running costs were, how much people were being paid. It's kind of an interesting thing to find. And I thought, I'll take a look at the Sunset Boulevard papers. So I'm going through it, and I get to the last page of this offering, and it lists all the investors in Sunset Boulevard. And there was a lawyer in the room. A lawyer used to sit with you in the room. You couldn't look at it by yourself. You had to have a lawyer there. And I said, oh, this page is interesting. And the lawyer said, oh, that shouldn't be there. You can't look at that. Okay. Kid you not, he got a phone call. They said, paging Mr. So-and-so, please take a call. He said, I'll be right back. And he left. And of course, what did I do? I looked at the last page, and I saw the name Barbara Walters, $100,000. Thought, well, that's interesting. Barbara Walters is investing. And she was a big ABC personality then. She was on 2020. And I just clocked. I thought Barbara Walters is investing in Sunset Boulevard. That's kind of interesting. And about a week later, I was watching Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters on 2020. And all of a sudden, Barbara is doing this profile of Andrew Lloyd Webber about his new big Broadway show, Sunset Boulevard. And I thought, okay, well, at some point she's got to say, and by the way, I put $100,000 in the show. Well, she never said that. So I went to I was at the Daily News then. I went to my editor the next day. I said, Barbara Walters invested in Sunset Boulevard. And if you saw that 2020 piece on Andrew Lloyd Webber in the show last night, she didn't disclose the fact that she has a financial interest in this show. He said, that's a good story. Write that up. So I tried to get through to Barbara Walters, which of course I couldn't. I got the publicist at ABC. His name was Martin something or other. Frankly, he was a complete idiot. And I said, hey, I'm going to do the story. Barbara Walters, she's promoting Sunset Boulevard on 2020 on ABC, and she's an investor in the show, and she didn't disclose that to the viewers. And he was like, oh, come on, it's not that big of a deal. I said, well, sort of is. Don't you think you should have a statement? And this is where he killed himself. He said to me, look, do you really think $100,000 means that much to Barbara Walters? I said, I can tell you it means a lot to the readers of the Daily News, and you just fucked your client big time. And it was on front page the next day. And the next week on 2020, Barbara Walters had to apologize to her viewers that she did not disclose the fact that she was an investor in Sunset Boulevard. So all of those great stories I put there, but I begin with Sunset Boulevard because it was the end of an era. We didn't know it at the time, but it was the last of those big British shows. It was the last of those big mega musicals where so much money was spent on it. And it won the Tony Award in 1995. And if you remember that year, the only competition it had was Smokey Joe's Cafe, which was a review of the songs of Lieber and Stoller. So Sunset won book and score because there was no other musical. And then it won the Tony for Best Musical. The next year, 1996, Andrew Lloyd Webber presents posthumously the Tony Award to one Jonathan Larson for Rent. And while Sunset Boulevard was riven with scandal and was so expensive and was beginning to kind of implode because it was too costly to keep running, this kid that none of us had ever heard of was working on this little show called Rent that was different. It was young. It was contemporary. It had a rock score. It was about what young people were dealing with in New York back then: AIDS, gentrification, the struggle to be an artist, drug use. And before Rent, all of these shows, Sunset Boulevard set in the eerie world of Norma Desmond of Hollywood in the 1950s and the 1920s. And, Phantom of the Opera is 19th century Paris. Les Miserables is the 1848 revolution. Cats is set, I don't know where it's set. I mean, it's got a big tire and a lot of smoke. It's set, I guess, on the heavy side layers where it's set. All these shows were set in remote fantasy kind of places. Rent was set right here, right now in New York City about young people. And it cost $100,000 to do off-Broadway, as opposed to Sunset Boulevard, which cost $14 million. Yeah. And Rent takes off and everything shifts. And then the British are gone. Andrew and Cameron, they exit stage right, and the Americans come back in. And of course, the sadness of Rent, and I really tried to get at the story of Jonathan Larson in my book, is that Jonathan Larson never lived to see the show that really changed everything, because, he saw that dress rehearsal. And he was being interviewed that night by the New York Times, Anthony Tomasini, who actually was not really writing a story about Jonathan and Rent. He was writing a story about the 100th anniversary of La Boheme, and Rent was based on La Boheme. So he was going to kind of include this little off-Broadway show into his big story about Puccini and La Boheme.
Right.
And after Jonathan finished that interview around 11 o'clock at night, he went home by himself to his walk-up apartment, just a few blocks from where I live here in the village, and put on his tea kettle and dropped dead of an aneurysm, and was found about 4 a.m. by his roommate, who'd been drinking around a bar, around the corner at a bar, and came home and found him dead on the floor.
Such a tragic story, and also the fact that he had been he'd gone to the hospital 3 times too, and no one had ever. He was misdiagnosed.
Everybody thought he had food. They thought he had food poisoning, or they thought he had food.
Yeah, but he if they had realized and done the right things, he might have actually. He might have lived. But you do such a wonderful job telling that whole story, and especially about him too. But how Rent really changed Broadway. It's so well done in your book. And I mean, they all are, but there's also another story that I really relished, and that was the return to Broadway of Edward Albee with Three Tall Women. And then you talk about, everybody was amazed because he had managed to piss off every critic in the world, basically. So his return is really a great story. And then you also tell the story of all the backstage drama with who else but Elaine Stritch. So maybe you could share a little bit about that story. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I didn't want this book to be only about, and I'm little Spy Valley here, folks.
Yes, I'm enjoying mine.
I didn't want this book only to be about musicals, because I love plays. I love plays. And the 90s, they were a big time for plays. I mean, you have to remember that Angels in America, Tony Kushner's play, opened in 92, 93. And that reminded everybody the power of the American theater, of plays and drama. Angels in America was a monumental achievement. And at the same time that Angels in America comes along, I knew Edward, because when I was a student at Columbia in the 80s, Edward, who could not get arrested in the theater. Nobody wanted to do an Edward Albee play. He'd had nothing but a bunch of flops, and he was written off. He was sort of like Tennessee Williams, You had this great moment in time, and then the second act is a disaster. So Edward was teaching a class at Columbia, and I took the class, and we became kind of friendly. And I kept in touch with him after I graduated. And when I was a reporter at Theater Week magazine in the beginning, and then the Daily News in the early 90s, occasionally Edward would have some little play done off Broadway. And I would always interview Edward when nobody wanted to talk to him. So one day I had lunch with him. Now, Edward was the least theatrical theater person you've ever met in your life. He was not showbiz at all. And he had this gunslinger mustache back in those days, and he always wore a leather jacket. And I remember going to have lunch with him, and he would say, Michael, I've written a new play. Would you like to take a look at it? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. Whatever you write, I'm interested. He said, well, he had his satchel. He took it out and he said, well, here it is. And I remember he put it on the table and he said, it's about my mother. I hated her. Okay, weird, but all right. And I tell you, when I first met Edward at Columbia, and I really didn't know who he was, but I thought I better find out who this professor is. And I read Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and I read that play cover to cover. I thought, oh my God, I've never read anything like this. It was amazing. That play is just amazing. And so I took this play, Three Tall Women, home, and I read it. And I had the same feeling reading that play as I had when I first read Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, it just jumped off the page. And I called Edward and I said, this is a great play. This is a great play. I said, how did you do it? And he said, well, my mother died. And after she died, I began to temper my hatred with a little bit of pity for her. And that's why I was able to write the play. And he could not get that play. He could not get that play done in New York. The premiere of Three Tall Women, as I say in the book, was done in Vienna because nobody in New York would do an Edward Albee play back then. And then the play finally got done upstate New York in Westchester at a tiny little theater with Myra Carter and Marion Seldes and Jordan Baker, great cast. And then God love Doug Abel at the Vineyard, he picked it up, took it to the Vineyard, and a critic like John Simon, remember John Simon at New York Magazine, one of the toughest critics of all time. John Simon had completely destroyed all the plays that Edward Albee had tried to write in the 80s. And John Simon wrote, and I think I quoted in my book, he said, if you had told me that Edward Albee still had talent, I would never have believed you until I've seen Three Tall Women. And that began this incredible comeback of Edward Albee. I mean, Three Tall Women was a sensation. And people wanted to take it to Broadway, but Edward wouldn't let it go to Broadway because Edward was so angry at Broadway, the way they had treated him and the way Broadway had killed his friend Tennessee Williams. And he did say to Jordan Baker, and she's quoted in the book, he said, I'm not going to take this play to Broadway. They're not going to do to me what they did to Tennessee. But it was explosive off Broadway, won the Pulitzer Prize. And then that led to that amazing revival of A Delicate Balance with Rosemary Murphy, George Grizzard, and Elaine Stritch, of course. And then a wonderful revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Kathleen Turner and Bill Irwin. And then Edward, at 75 years old, he comes up with The Goat, or Who is Sylvia? And at 75 years old, he writes this play, about an architect who literally falls in love with a goat. A goat. I mean, it's a goat. He brings the goat home. He's in love with a goat. And the audience was going nuts. And people would walk out of that play in previews, and Edward loved it. He loved the fact that he was getting under the skin of the bourgeoisie who was going to Broadway. And I was very pleased to be able to include Edward's comeback in my book because, I just loved him to death. He was such a great guy, such an immensely talented writer. And for him to have that comeback in the 90s was very exciting. And I had a front row seat for it. So I try to convey that in the book. And then, of course, Elaine, who's totally...
Yeah, that's the other piece of it.
I mean, listen, I loved Elaine, was a dear friend of mine. She was completely insane. And when she was in A Delicate Balance, and I'm sure many of the people listening to us, they must have seen that production. It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. And, Elaine was playing Claire in the play, who's an alcoholic and a chain smoker. And Elaine had given up drinking and given up smoking. So she's playing somebody who she once was. And I talked to Andre Bishop for the book, who, Lincoln Center produced the play. And Andre said, you had to cut Elaine a lot of slack because she was playing a character that she had been and did not want to be anymore. But every night on stage, she had to go back to being that person who drank all the time and smoked all the time. So her behavior was a little nutty. And backstage, it was kind of rough. I mean, George, whom I knew too, and George was like, we do the show the same way every night. Here's the blocking. Here's how I say the line. We don't change it. And Elaine is like changing things, doing this and doing that. George could not stand her antics, her behavior. And one night, when they were taking their bows and the curtain came down, he hit her. He slugged her. He hit her. Couldn't take it anymore. And then she ran into her dressing room and she got her curling iron and she chased him around the backstage trying to hit him with a curling iron. And Andre told me, he said, Michael, the only time you were safe in the theater was when the curtain was up. And they gave great performances. But when the curtain came down, you took your life in your own hands. And A Delicate Balance could have run a lot longer than it did. But the stage manager was having a nervous breakdown. Andre was having a nervous breakdown. The cast members were having a nervous breakdown. And Andre said, I had to close it. I said, they would have killed each other. If we ran one more day, George and Elaine would have murdered each other. So I called Edward and I said, Edward, it's been a great run. It's terrific. We can't go on. We have to close. And you know what? Edward couldn't have cared less. His comeback was secure, and that's all he cared about.
Such a great story. And these are just some of the many stories in Michael's book. And the reason you're all going to want to go out as soon as you get off the Zoom tonight and go to Amazon and order it because it's so wonderful. So we've talked about some of the hits. What about, what do you think was the biggest flop of the 90s?
I mean, I think the big scandal that I cover in my book is the story of Garth Drabinsky, the Canadian impresario who created this company called Livent. And he came to New York with Kiss of the Spider Woman, big show back in the early 90s. And he built this empire. And he created the first ever publicly traded on the stock market in Toronto and New York. It was on the NASDAQ, I think, a company that produced theater. And you could invest, you could buy shares in Livent. And Garth built up this gigantic empire doing these big shows, Kiss of the Spider Woman. He did Showboat a brilliant production that Hal Prince directed, that Elaine was in, by the way. Funny story about that. He paid, because Garth paid for a lot of money for everything. He paid Elaine Stritch $25,000 a week to be in Showboat. She had one song, which she sang to a baby. It was like a doll, you know, and it was Elaine going, "Why do I love you? Why do you love me?" And I remember seeing that show with Steve Sondheim, and Steve said, "I don't know if she's going to sing to that baby or eat it." And and Showboat was so expensive, but it was wonderful. It was a wonderful, wonderful production. But I went to the opening night, and my date was a wonderful old producer that some of your viewers tonight may know of, called Arthur Cantor. Arthur Cantor was a great producer.
Mm-hmm.
Cheapest man on Broadway. He only did one-person shows because they were cheap. You know, he did Eileen Atkins in A Room of One's Own, the Virginia Woolf play. Arthur only did one-person shows. Somebody once asked Arthur, they said, "Arthur, why don't you do a two-character play?" And Arthur said, "I don't do spectacle." So I, I took Arthur with me to the opening of Showboat. This would be 96, I guess it was, 95, 96. And at the end of the show, Garth came out and Hal came out, and they brought the cast out, and then Garth and Hal, they brought all the stage hands out and all the stage and like there were all these people on this stage of the Gershwin Theater. And I remember Arthur sitting there thinking, "This does not make sense. I can't figure this out." I said, "What, Arthur?" He said, "There is no way you can do a show with this many people and make a profit. It's not possible." And Arthur was onto something, because what was going on with Livent was that Garth Drabinsky was doing these big shows, and he wasn't doing just Showboat in New York. He was doing it in Chicago and London and LA, and a tour and Ragtime he did in Toronto, and then in LA, and then in New York, and spending enormous amounts of money. But old canny people like Arthur Cantor and my old friend Jerry Schoenfeld and Phil Smith, Jimmy Niederlander, they're all like, something is not adding up here, because they knew the bones of the business.
Mm-hmm.
And they could not figure out how these shows that Garth Drabinsky's doing can really kick off the kind of money you need to support his infrastructure, his theaters, his building of theaters, the amount of money he spent on advertising. And then it all came crashing down with Ragtime when Garth brought Ragtime in. He should have brought it in when it opened in, I guess, 96 or 97 in Toronto. He should have brought it into New York right then, because that season was kind of weak on Broadway. I think we had Titanic, The Life, and Steel Pier. And had Ragtime come in that season, it would have won every Tony Award in sight. But nope, Garth was building his Ford Center on 42nd Street, and it wasn't ready. So he waited a year because he wanted Ragtime to christen his new great theater. And he waited a year to bring Ragtime in from Toronto. And within that year, Disney came up with this little show called The Lion King, directed by Julie Taymor. And as I detail in the book, the rivalry between Livent and Garth Drabinsky and Disney, Ragtime, and The Lion King was very intense. And at the end of the day, Lion King won the Tony Award, swiped it from Ragtime. And within a year, we found out that Garth's entire company was a fraud, that he had kept 2 sets of books all these years. One set was for the investors, for the regulators at the SEC, showing everything is profitable. Every show I've done has made gazillions of dollars. But the secret set of books was the one that showed this deepening sea of red ink. And at the end of the day, Garth Drabinsky went to jail for forgery and fraud, and Livent went bankrupt.
Yeah, that was quite the story at the time, and still is. I don't think we've seen that something of that scope in quite a while. And that, as you said, when you end the book talking about 9/11, which so many of us remember. Obviously, we all remember 9/11, and probably most of us here remember, Broadway going dark and then coming back, and it was such a triumphant moment. And then you also talk about how all of these 90s shows like Rent and whatnot, which really put Broadway into the pop culture, really led to Hamilton and Dear Evan Hansen. And then I just want to read the very last sentence of your book, because it actually stopped my heart. And I'm going to read it now, and then we'll chat a little more.
I
You
hope it's well.
wrote,
I hope it's well written.
Broadway is in the midst of a new golden age. And it made me cry, honestly, when I read it.
Yeah.
So you wrote that pre-pandemic, and here we are all these months later, wondering what is going to happen to Broadway. So if you have a little, I don't know how much time you have with us. We'd love to talk about that. And if you have time to take any questions, if not, we'll
Sure.
just, that would be great. So what are you hearing? What do you think? I know you talk to everybody in Broadway. What is going on here? What will it take?
It's going to take a vaccine. It's going to take, first of all, you could not engineer something like the coronavirus to really destroy Broadway if you were a diabolical person. You've got actors who sing on stage to each other. They enunciate. That's how you spread the virus. You got musicians in a pit. They're blowing on instruments. That's how you spread the virus. You cannot bring Broadway back until the people who work on Broadway feel safe and comfortable coming back to work. And that's going to take a vaccine, and that's going to take rapid testing. You know, at some point when the theater's open, everybody walking in the stage door is going to have to be tested. And you hope you have a test to say, yep, you're negative. You know, go on, do the show. Oh, no, positive, can't come to work today. And that's going to take some time, frankly. But when you get that, the other issue is, when does the audience feel comfortable coming back to Broadway?
Exactly.
You know, New York was the epicenter of the pandemic in March and April and into May, and we got the second wave coming, and that's killed tourism. It's killed it. And as you know, in the 90s, as I show in my book, Broadway became so big, and New York was such this gleaming city that tourists from all over the world were coming. I mean, they're the ones who were paying the $1,000 a ticket to see Hamilton. They were coming from all over the place, and people with lots of money were coming to New York to see Broadway shows. When do people feel safe and comfortable coming back to New York? And I don't think any of us has an answer to that. You can open up the shows, and frankly, I don't think the shows are going to be opening up until 2022. I think we're going to lose another year, another year of theater. And 2022, when they can open, will the audience be there? I don't know. I will tell you this, though. The one thing producers and theater owners and the unions have to figure out is, you cannot reopen Broadway and say, hey, we're back in business, and by the way, it's still $1,000 to see a show. Those premium prices, they have to go. You have to entice people to come back to the theater at reasonable prices. And it's got to be for New Yorkers, because we don't know when the tourists are going to come back to New York. We don't know. But the New Yorkers are here. We're here.
Right.
And if somebody says to you, listen, you want to come to see Hamilton tonight, and it's $150 or $200, not $1,500, people will come. And you've got to start it that way, with reasonably priced tickets for Broadway shows. But that requires everybody who runs Broadway to restructure the whole economics of this business for a time. I was talking to Rocco Landisman, who ran Jujamson Theaters, and Tom Schumacher, who runs Disney. I did a 92nd Street Zoom chat at the 92nd Street Y with them on Tuesday. And they said everyone's going to have to take a haircut for a long time. The only way we can get people back to this business is to say, we're open, the price is reasonable, take a chance, come to see what we have to offer.
Yeah, well, it's just so sad, and to see so many creative people out of work, but everyone, all the people backstage, the people who take the tickets, it's not just the actors and the performers, it's just the impact is so enormous. And then of course the whole restaurant business and everything around Times Square that's revolved around there. So it's going to be very different when we do get back. That's
it breaks my heart, but one of my favorite restaurants, the classic, one of the great New York restaurants, Sardi's, has been closed since March. Yeah. And they have not been able to reopen at all, because with no tourism, there's no Sardi's. They can't do outdoor dining in Times Square. I don't know if you guys have been able to get to the city at all or go around Times Square. I ride my bike all over the place. And certainly at the height of the pandemic, I was riding around looking at neighborhoods, and Times Square was deserted. I mean, it was completely and totally deserted. And I talked to my friend Sean, who, he's Vincent Sardi's grandson, and he runs Sardi's. And he said, Michael, we're based on Broadway. If there are no shows, there are no customers. You know, we're not a neighborhood restaurant. We're a world famous restaurant. Broadway is a world famous place. No shows, no sorries. And, you know, the heartbreak is, of course, that, you know, the rich people on Broadway, the Hugh Jackmans, the Nathan Lanes, the Scott Rudins, they'll be able to weather the storm. But Broadway employs 90,000 people. And a lot of those people are middle class people.
Yeah,
Stagehands, got kids
absolutely.
going to college, ushers, you know, the waiters at Sardi's. Those people have been out of work for 8 months, and they're going to probably be out of work for another year. And I don't know how you survive, frankly. I really don't. It's going to be
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah, I think there needs to be some special funding to help out the arts, quite frankly. I mean, we bailed out the auto industry, we bailed out the
And the banks, we
airline
always bail out the banks.
industry. Yeah, exactly. We need to bail out Broadway and the arts in general. So it's a great book. And I know I'm already getting so many comments in the chat box of people who already pre-ordered or in the process of reading it, or they're all going to be leaving here tonight and buying the book. And it's, as usual, you're such a delight, Michael. You're not only a great writer telling stories, but you're just a great storyteller. And if you don't listen to WOR in the morning, you need to start doing that, because he and Len are delightful. And I was so impressed this last year because they talk about everything from politics to entertainment to sports. And while they disagree with each other, they were able to have a civil discourse, which should have been something that we should have all been able to do. So I so admired them for doing that for the past year. So
well, that was the whole idea of the show. I mean, Len and I come at things from a different political point of view, but we're friends. And in this divided time, this terrible time, I think you can have spirited disagreements about politics. But at the end of the day, you got to be able to say, okay, the arguments are over with. Let's have a laugh. Let's have a drink. And we're still friends.
Exactly. So well said. So on that note, Michael, really, we all applaud you. Thank you so much. You are just so appreciative of your time tonight. And I thank all of,
here's to a good New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Cheers.
yes, and here's to another bestseller. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.